you to feel with me the following story. I want you to feel your emotions and take note of them as you hear what I'm about to say. A woman goes to the mailbox and gathers all the various items that clog her box that day. Walking back to the house, she begins to shuffle through her mail and think what she believes can go straight to the recycling, that which she might read and then have to shred before recycling, and the other things that actually look important, like their real mail, things that she should read and keep and pay attention to. So upon entering the house, she takes the mail and she divides it into those 3 different piles. One letter, she really can't tell which pile it goes into. She can't tell if it's important or not because it doesn't have a return address that she recognizes. But it bids her to open immediately important information about your home mortgage. She still isn't sure if it's junk or scam or important. So she has to open the letter to find out. And she receives a very surprising notice. She has paid her mortgage in full. She wasn't expecting this. While she's no mathematician, she still knew she had a couple of $1,000s left. But she eagerly anticipated the day when she wouldn't have to make a substantial payment to the mortgage company every month. She had even started dreaming about what she would do with the extra hundreds of dollars in her account each month. But it was still a year or more away, so she was very guarded about this good news. She immediately called the 1-800 number at the bottom of the notice to find out more information. After listening to some smooth jazz for a few moments and verifying her information and her account number, not just to one representative but to another, she was told that there had been an accounting error early on in her loan. And back in those days, you know that everything matters because the interest is accumulating like crazy. And that error caused a cumulative effect that made her already paid off her loan without even knowing it. In fact, they informed her that they would have to issue her a refund. Wow. How did you feel hearing that story? Confused? Suspicious? Like anything that good sounds too good to be true. Were you cautious? Were you thinking, lady, you better not get your hopes up too soon. That's probably a scam. Were you hopeful? Were you thinking about a day in the future that one day you would receive a notice like that, be it a surprise or not? And did that kind of excite you, thinking about the future without that kind of debt hanging over your head? I imagine when we recite the Lord's Prayer, we have all felt those kinds of things. Sometimes it just sounds too good to be true. So we try to take it out of a concrete meaning and we spiritualize it. This is all metaphorical, right? Let's not get our hopes up that our God actually cares about our real debts. Some felt so strongly that it wasn't really about indebtedness that they changed the word to sin or trespasses. So I was very thankful that Sally read from a particular version. They called it debt. You heard as we sang the Lord's Prayer and as we recited on a weekly basis that we do not use the word debt. But the Greek implies that it is something that is owed. Forgive us, God, what we owe to you as we forgive what others owe to us. I think what we're talking about is a system of debt. The ones Jesus are instructing, they are living under a system of dominance. They are paying taxes to uphold the Roman Empire, and they have no choice in the matter. I expect it must have felt a little bit like being under mafia rule. You better pay them or else. And that is why the tax collectors were so reviled. That is why it was so scandalous that Jesus not only talked to them, but he broke bread with the likes of Zacchaeus at his own house. What kind of Savior is this that has come into our world? He is a Savior that realizes that people live under a burden, a web of indebtedness. And sometimes they get so hopeless because they can't see a way out of it. Does this prayer have spiritual implications for us? Of course it does. Jesus wants us to have hope for any who are suffering under the strain of any kind of dominance. They might be experiencing food scarcity. So they are not only praying for the real, actual portion of daily bread, but in a way they're also asking for the fortitude to survive spiritually until their next serving is offered. They are praying for the forgiveness of real debt. This is monetary debt. It could be the debt of goods that have already been given. It could be the debt of services already rendered. But they are also praying for hope, even if it's a cautious hope, of living one day when they are wholly delivered from the evil one. And that evil one would be the one who imposes such unfair debt upon them. The book that I read from earlier, that is a loaner from Betty Long, is again called Black Seeds in the Bluegrass, and is by Jacqueline Annette Sue. She recalls her summers spent here in North Middletown with her Butler and Weathers families. She traces her ancestry through the black community all the way back to 2 slave women. She talks about how her family survived some very difficult times, even after slavery ended with a constitutional amendment. She says that blacks still relied on what she calls the kinship economy. One person might know how to fix a wagon wheel, and another can smith shoes for a horse. One has a farm that can grow much needed straw to feed the animals. Another one can lend her skills of cooking. Another woman might know how to sew and mend clothes. Others still earn their money by keeping houses for whites. Now, they didn't share all things in common, like the early church is described as doing in the book of Acts, but there was a local economy of sharing and helping. One day you give, another day you receive. Don't you think it would be best to be generous in this sort of economy, an economy of kinship? If not, you might find yourself in a real bind. You could find yourself on the debt side of the community ledger, and that would not be a favorable position. You always want to be on the side of needing to forgive a debt rather than needing to have one forgiven. I think the small towns might operate a little bit like this. I know who I could call who would come and get me out of a ditch. I know who I would call if a chair breaks at my house, or if the plumbing goes wacky again, or if that electrical outlet decides to burn up. You can tell we've had a little experience in the short time that we've lived here. We have learned how to figure out our way in this kinship economy. I'm afraid that I am so lacking in skills that I'm on the debt side of this economy. But this prayer, it operates with us on several levels. It is about the daily interactions of how you get food and services. It is also about this system of dominance that's weighing down upon them. And it's also about this spiritual notion that things here on this earth pale in comparison to the kingdom that lies before us. This is a kingdom prayer. It is a subversive prayer to the empire. To pray it restores the real order of the community. It subverts the power of the oppressor. And it calls us to long for the day when God's rule will claim our hearts, our lands, and our leaders. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, we might have a debt of some kind or another. Perhaps a farmer has taken out a loan to put seed in the ground. The family takes out a construction loan to build the house of their dreams. The young student going off to school can't afford it now, but takes out those student loans and hopes that his or her profession will make it possible to pay back one day. Jesus is not saying that in the kingdom all debts will vanish or the need to take out a loan will never occur. I think what Jesus is saying is that in God's reign, these debts are able to be paid back. And so in our society, we still need to pay attention to who has the dominance. I get a little irked when I see lying around town these cups that say Cash Express, and they're filled with pins for the public to take. In my opinion, whoever is passing those out around town needs to be run out of town. These are payday lenders, and their practices are entirely unethical. They charge exorbitant interest rates up to 600%, and that does not include the fee per $100 loaned. They prey on the vulnerable who are buckling under the pressure to pay somebody else off. And so it's like borrowing from Peter to pay back Paul, except you never can pay back Peter, or a lot of people cannot. And so they feel the pressure to take out a loan that is nearly impossible to repay. The cards are stacked against them. I read an article this past week that millennials are unable to enter the housing market because of their surmounting student loan debt. Now, there was a time just a generation or two ago that students could work a job during the summer and pay a huge chunk of their tuition at perhaps a state school. And I know that several of us worked our way through college. So don't think there's something wrong with these kids today. They ought to be able to do it like we did. No, the system has entirely changed. So we need to examine the rates at which college tuition is rising, especially in our state schools, of which we are supposed to have some say. We should be asking, why is this the case, and how we are allowing this to happen? How are students supposed to go to school and not come out with a lifetime of debt? Many, sadly, are discovering that college is so unaffordable that they can't go even if they wanted to. No wonder these young people can't buy a house or contribute to the economy in other ways. This might also be contributing to the low birth rates among this age group. They realize that if they can't afford a house, they certainly can't afford to raise children. So you might remember this weird word in the Old Testament back when you studied it in Sunday school called usury. You remember that word? Usury is interest. And there are over 100 references to it in the Old Testament. And you recall that Jesus told us earlier in the passage that he did not come to abolish the law, but he came to make sure that it was being fulfilled. He is coming to put into practice these laws that the Jews in his midst they're aware of, but they're not really practicing so much. And so one example is in Deuteronomy 23. You shall not charge interest on loans to your brother or your sister. Interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent. You may charge a foreigner, so those people think it's an interest, but you may not charge your brother or sister, that the Lord your God may bless you in all you undertake in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. So that passage says for certain things you can't charge interest, but you can to a foreigner, but there are other passages that forbid charging interest altogether. So this passage states clearly that you cannot charge interest for anything that is necessary for life, such as food. If you lend something to someone that you would consider a brother or sister, you cannot magnify their vulnerability by adding interest to their debt. There were laws in place to make sure that debt had a limit. Sadly, our Old Testament permits some forms of slavery. But even slavery in that day was temporary. Every slave was freed on the 7th year. The land was not held forever, but it was temporarily leased to different families. If you want to understand Jesus better, I think it would behoove us to return to the Hebrew Bible, the scriptures that Jesus upholds, and pay attention to what he upholds and what he keeps silent. That's a good indicator. One thing he upholds is Leviticus 25, especially as he is reading from the scroll in the Gospel of Luke. He is teaching in the temple and he picks up a scroll, and it's actually Isaiah, but the prophet was talking about the Jubilee that is in Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25 paints a portrait for us. It is a model for how to live within God's blessing in a community. It's kind of like an economy of kinship. It discusses how we should work for 6 days and then rest on the 7th. Work your land for 6 years and let it rest on the 7th. And do not worry. God will provide for you and your family during that year of rest because your fields have already been abundant for 7 years prior. And perhaps during your years of plenty, you have shared with your neighbor who is experiencing less. And so that neighbor will recall that favor done to you and will also lend to you during your year off. And after 7 cycles of these 7 years, all of this borrowed land that has been temporarily leased to individuals and families, it all gets reset back to the tribes. And on the 50th year, 7 cycles of 7 is 49 years. On the 50th year is the Jubilee. Everyone in the nation of Israel would receive a notice in the mail that all their debts had been forgiven. Their debts of money, their debts of land, services, good, all of that, all their debts had been wiped clean. And the trumpet would sound, and the celebration would commence. Sadly, we don't have a lot of evidence that this was practiced by the Jews. And I think that's why Jesus reminds them of this law. We reveal who we are by how we treat people. It shows what we treasure. And back to the group of us who attended the Shabbat service at the temple this past Friday, Rabbi Wirtschafter had a lovely sermon, which he reminded the people that they weren't required to like everyone, but Torah requires them to help those in need. This was based on a passage in Exodus that says that any should return an animal that is loose, and upon returning it, you are to help the neighbor unload the weight on the animal. And so he said that means it's like helping your neighbor as a flat tire or is stuck on the side of the road. You don't have to like them, but you do have to help them. So it means that your neighbor, like me, if she were stuck in a ditch off of Thatcher's Mill Road, and you approach this car, this little Prius. I mean, who drives a Prius in the country? Everybody drives these big trucks. Pretty identifiable by Prius, aren't I? So she's probably one of those tree huggers. And just as you get closer, you receive confirmation because she's got one of those bumper stickers that says coexist. It has all the different symbols from different religions, and you're rolling your eyes, but you stop. And as you approach the car, my goodness, she has a rainbow sticker to boot. And as she gets out, she's still wearing her Ruth Bader Ginsburg crown from the night before. That person. You same is true if I come across one of those ginormous trucks with the exhaust pipe that says a Prius repeller. Understand that. With a huge rifle hanging in the back window. And as I approach, not even knowing how I'm going to help, but maybe just offer a ride, a fella gets out wearing his red MAGA hat. I don't have to like him, but I am required to help him. That is the economy of kinship. And honestly, what most of us find out is when we get close enough to help our neighbor, we tend not to really care very much about their political ideologies or their social affiliations. Because if we develop an economy of kinship, we grow to love our neighbors as much as we love ourselves. And in this kind of economy, we testify to who we are and what we treasure. We witness who we are and to whom we belong. Praise be to God.